Some
This
words this
conference will
evening.
now be recorded.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start us off this evening. Oh, did he come
Hi,
on? No.
hi, Anna. No, that's fine. That's fine. You can just introduce Larry.
Okay, yeah, I know everyone's been waiting. Thank you, Bob.
Sure.
That was Bob Worsnack, who is part of the Hopewell Museum, who is actually a co-sponsor for this program tonight, along with the Hopewell Valley Historical Society. So I do want to thank them for being here this evening and for helping bring this event to the community. I do want to introduce Larry real quick. I've been very much looking forward to this evening's program. It is co-sponsored with the Hopewell Valley Historical Society, as I said, and the Hopewell Museum, two partnerships that the Friends of the Hopewell branch is profoundly grateful for, especially as the groups work together creating educational opportunities for our community. Tonight's presenter, Larry Kidder, is a retired high school history teacher who's taught for 40 years in both public and private schools, including 32 years at the Hun School of Princeton. His current research interests fall into two main areas: the history of the Pleasant Valley area in Northwest Hopewell Township, New Jersey, and topics relating to the American Revolution history of what is today Mercer County, New Jersey. He's published numerous articles and books, such as 10 Crucial Days, Washington's Vision for Victory Unfolds, and then there's Farming Pleasant Valley, 250 Years of Life in Rural Hopewell Township, New Jersey, and most recently, The Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man, Jacob Francis, 1754 to 1836, which we are so very fortunate to get to hear more about this evening. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, but Larry's desire to research our local history is truly a gift to all of us. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to you, Larry.
Okay. Thanks very much. And I hope I'm still being heard. I hope I'm connected right.
I can hear you. You're all good.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you everybody for your patience in getting us started here. I'm really looking forward to talking with you tonight about Jacob Francis. It's a story that's been of interest to me for well over a decade, and it's been a long haul to get everything to put together. But I stuck with it because Jacob Francis is a man whose story I think is extremely valuable to know. Partly because his world that was revolutionary in several ways was particularly difficult for him because he was a free black man in a time of slavery. And so he was neither an enslaved person nor was he a white person who had full rights. His rights were restricted in some ways, and he had to deal with the racism that grew out of slavery, even though he himself was not and never had been enslaved. So his story is a little bit different from the ones that we normally hear. So anyway, the cover of the book, which you see on the first slide here, I designed primarily to kind of raise questions about him. My publisher, who's done my other books, always likes to have some kind of action scene on the cover, but I really couldn't do that for him because we don't know what he looked like, for one thing, and there's no real pictures, paintings or otherwise of him. So what I did was, since it's the revolutionary world, I wanted to show you the world of Jacob Francis, and that's what the map shows. He was associated with Amwell Township and Flemington Village in particularly. He also spent some time in Trenton that we'll talk about shortly. And he also spent time in Salem, Massachusetts and Boston, Massachusetts, which might seem a little odd for somebody from New Jersey in the 18th century. He also spent some time around New York City, and that was connected primarily with the revolution, but not completely. So anyway, you get an idea of the world that he inhabited and the time of his revolutionary world. The three flags represent, on the left-hand side, the year of his birth was the King's colors, the Union flag of Great Britain, when New Jersey was a colony. In 1775-76, Jacob fought with the Continental Army under the flag that was very common at that point. And then when he died, he was under the American flag, in this case, the 25-star American flag of 1836. So this shows the revolution of the independence movement at any rate. And there's also other revolutions involved also. The two primary revolutions were that one of the War of Independence, really, to create the United States, but also the revolution in human rights that continues to this day. The revolution to create the United States was completed during his lifetime, but the other revolution continues to this day. Now, how does Jacob relate to the Hopewell Valley, since this is the Hopewell Valley that we're living in? We can see that most specifically on the night of December 25, 26, 1776. And I think from the date and the map, you know exactly what I'm going to be talking about here. Jacob crossed with Washington and then traversed Bear Tavern Road through the Jacobs Creek crossing and everything to Birmingham, or what we know today more as West Trenton. And, that was that night of storm and, the nor'easter that they had to march through on their way to attack the Hessians who were occupying Trenton at that time. Jacob was with General Sullivan's division that split off and took the river road to Trenton, while General Nathaniel Greene's division, along with Washington, took the what would be the Pennington Road route that took them to where the battle monument is to this day. So Jacob took the river road, and they were, pretty much unopposed as they went along until they got to a home and large farm known as the Hermitage, one of the largest in the Trenton area. It was just outside of Trenton. And at the Hermitage, as you see in the upper left-hand corner here, there was a outpost of 50 Hessians. Those Hessians wore green uniforms, as you see here. They were light infantry. And the Sullivan's division ran into them. They very much outnumbered. There were well over 1,000 in Sullivan's division against the 50 in that guard post. So they forced them to retreat back towards Trenton, and Jacob and Sullivan's division followed them all the way. They crossed very much close to the barracks on their way into what was then downtown Trenton. And it's interesting, in Jacob's later comments, he talks about getting to the intersection of what today would be 2nd Street and Warren Street, what was back then King Street. And he said as he looked up to the left, he could see the battle. He could see where Greene's troops and Washington's troops had opened the battle, firing their artillery down the street, and the Hessians had come out, into the street to try to defend themselves. And so he saw the main battle there. At the same time, he was aware that there was another group of Hessians that were coming straight at Sullivan's division. And he noted that part of Sullivan's division was detached to go and take them on, while his particular regiment and brigade went down to the Assunpink Creek and crossed the stone bridge there at the grist mill. They were essentially, by the way, following those 50 Hessians that they had encountered, who retreated all the way through town and got the heck out of there before getting involved in the main battle. And Sullivan's division then developed along the Assunpink to really prevent any Hessians from escaping the battle in town. Now, that battle that started out on the main street went out into an apple orchard just outside of Trenton, just a block or so outside. Trenton was really small back then. And this is where Colonel Rahl is going to be mortally wounded, and 2 of the 3 Hessian regiments are going to surrender. That other group, the one that had attacked Sullivan's division, the Kniefhausen Regiment, was still operating. They had not surrendered yet, but they were retreating because, again, they're outnumbered by Sullivan's brigade. And Sullivan continues after them. And after Rahl's group surrenders, that frees up American troops to come down and help out. And now that 3rd regiment, the Kniefhausen Regiment, is totally surrounded, and they are going to surrender. And Jacob, in his account of the battle, remarks about how he was, on the opposite side of the Assunpink from them, but watching the surrender, and saw the Hessians, put their muskets to the ground and stand there in surrender. And then, of course, they all got taken back across the river that night. And a couple days later, then Washington came back to Trenton and was going to occupy it. And on December 31st, Jacob was one of the soldiers whose enlistment expired. We'll talk about his enlistment in just a second, but his year-plus enlistment expired on the 31st. Most of the men in his regiment, it was the same thing. And most of the men in the other regiments, it was the same thing. This was one reason why Washington was so anxious to attack before the end of the year, because he was going to lose part of his army. He begged the men to extend their enlistment for 6 weeks, giving time for new regiments that were being formed to come online and be able to take over for them. And he offered his troops a $10 bounty, which was essentially an extra month's pay that would be on top of their 6 weeks' pay. And, about half his men, as a rough ballpark figure, decided to extend their enlistments. Jacob was one who did not. And I think it's interesting to look at the reasons why. His situation was he had been in the Army now for 14 months. And he was a survivor, as all of the men were. I don't want to single him out there. Anybody who was still with Washington at this point had gone through hell and back over the previous year or a few months beyond in the siege of Boston and the New York campaign. Mostly they had been decimated by illness. There was some battle casualties. There were some just regular work casualties. What they were doing was tough stuff. But illness really decimated the Army, and Jacob, had survived all of that, as we'll see in a bit. He was owed 7.5 months' pay. And I mention that because really the soldiers at that time looked at their enlistment as a contract. They agreed to serve X number of days, and they expected to be paid, they expected to be fed, they expected to be clothed, to be provided with weapons, etc., in addition to having smart officers who would not put them into ridiculously bad combat situations. But the other side, the Continental Congress, had not been living up to their part of the contract. And Jacob represents that when he's owed 7.5 months of pay out of the 14 months that he'd been in the military. He was verbally discharged. They didn't even give him a written discharge, and was told that he would need to go to Peekskill, New York, when he got a message in order to get his back pay and in order to get his written discharge. And in the meantime, they did give him some money, but it was only about a little less than half of what he was really owed. Now think about it. He doesn't have a written discharge. He's wearing a military uniform, what's left of one. He's a free black man, and when he runs into somebody, a civilian in New Jersey, they are going to jump to the conclusion that he might be a deserter from the Army, and he can't prove otherwise. So he's going to be in a tough situation here. But he knew that when he was at Trenton, he was only about 15 miles from his place of birth. Showing you the arrow there. He had not seen his mother for about a decade. He'd been away from home, as we'll talk about in a minute, for over a decade. Both he and his mother were illiterate, so they had not exchanged letters or anything like that. He didn't know if she was still alive. He didn't know what her condition was. He really wanted to find out. He also wanted to find out his name. He knew his first name was Jacob, but he did not know his family name. As he said in a pension application written in the 1830s, he said he did not know his family name, but he called himself Jacob Gulick, pronounced Hulick, and it was only after he got reconnected with his mother that she informed him that his family name was Francis, and so he adopted that and used that the rest of his life. He'd been using the name Gulick for over probably at least a decade, and just didn't really know completely who he was, and he wanted to find out. What he found out, what we know about him, is that he was born on January 15th, 1754 in Amwell Township. It's unusual to know the birth date of a free black person or an enslaved black person from the 18th century, and I'll tell you in a minute exactly why it is that Jacob's birth date was very well known to him, and he could make it well known to others. His mother was a free black woman whose name we don't know. He never mentions her name in any writings about her. She was just mom as far as he was concerned. He doesn't know who his father was. Not only did he not know, father's last name or the family's last name, he never knew a father, his biological father. He didn't have any siblings that he mentions. It was just him and mom, and we have no idea, what her situation was. Had she been freed? Had she been enslaved and then freed? Had she been born free? We just don't know. And we don't know if she had been married, if she had been raped, just what the situation might be there. But his mother apparently had trouble supporting him as an only child, as a single mother, and she may also have wanted him to have a father image in his life. I just don't know what her total situation was, but she indentured him, which means that she received some money in order to turn him over to a local farmer who would house him, feed him, clothe him, and then after a certain number of years would set him free to live the rest of his life as a free person. Jacob is very clear when he talks about his indenture time that it was his time that the man owned, not his person. He definitely understood he was not enslaved, but that his time had been bought so that he was under the command, if you will, of this individual. Normally, he would have stayed with that one individual until he reached the age of 21. And by the way, that's how we know his age, because they had to know his birth date in order to know his freedom date at age 21. But the man who purchased his indenture apparently didn't need him or didn't find him satisfactory. He was awfully a young kid at the time. And the first man who owned his time was a farmer named Henry Wambaugh, who was in his mid-40s, but had a much younger wife, and they had just had their first son in 1760. And of course, he's only going to be a toddler at the time that Henry Wambaugh buys Jacob's time. So Jacob wasn't much older than their son and probably couldn't help with a lot of farm work. Henry Wambaugh was definitely a farmer. Another thing about indentured time, by the way, is there was no idea that Jacob would be taught a trade. He was just working for the man. He was not expected to be taught anything in particular. So it's not as good as an apprenticeship, for example. Henry Wambaugh sold Jacob's time after not too long to a man named Michael Hart, which of course is a name that in Hopewell Valley we know about a lot, but we don't know about this man too much or what his dealings with Jacob were, because he sold Jacob's time to the man that Jacob took the name of, Minne Gulick, or who pronounced it Hulick, who was in his mid-30s and had a wife and no children when Jacob was working for him. He would later have a bundle of children, but when Jacob was with him, he didn't have any. So Jacob may have fit into the family almost like a son. And that may be why he, wanted to take the Gulick or Hulick name, because he'd had that kind of a feeling in that family. Although they didn't keep him for very long either. He was then, his time was sold to Joseph Saxton, who was a merchant, not a farmer, and he took Jacob as his manservant to New York to help him out in his business and that kind of thing, kind of look after him, like a butler kind of thing, or a manservant. And then from New York, Joseph took him to the island of St. John in the Caribbean, where Jacob could certainly see another side of enslavement that probably disturbed him no end, and maybe put him in fear of being sold into slavery down there by Mr. Saxton. He was there for about 6-8 months, and then Saxton took him to Salem, Massachusetts. If you remember on the map, we had Salem and we had New York. These are this is how they fit into Jacob's revolutionary world. Now, when they got to Salem, it was November of 1768, and Jacob is about 14 years old. So you can see he's already on his fourth owner of his time, and he's only 14 years old. As a young boy, he'd had to adapt to new situations, many times, and figure out how to get along with people and how to, deal with life. And in Salem, Mr. Saxton sold the remainder of Jacob's time to a local merchant named Benjamin DeLand, and DeLand actually kept him for the longest period of time, 6 years, so that the ages of 15 to 21, Jacob spent with Mr. DeLand, and that was from 1768 to 1775. So imagine what's going on in Massachusetts near Boston in those years. I mean, the revolution is just, going to be an integral part of Jacob's life. Mr. DeLand got involved with it in many ways, and as did Jacob. So after Jacob gets his independence, leaves his indenture in January of 75, a few months later, towards the end of the year in October, he decides to enlist in the Continental Army. I find that interesting and kind of odd, because having spent 21 years most of it as an indentured servant, enlisting in the Army was almost going back into indentured system again, because as he said, men owned his time when he was indentured. Well, for the year he enlisted, the Army is going to own his time. Yes, they're going to pay him theoretically, but in many ways, he's not going to be able to decide what he wants to do day in and day out. And he's not going to be learning a trade or anything like that. So in many ways, it's going to be like extending his indenture. But he went from Salem to Cambridge outside Boston, where the Continental Army was forming up. They had started forming in June, and Washington had taken command then. And here it is, October. he was able to enlist in a Continental Regiment that consisted mostly of men from Massachusetts, Colonel Paul Dudley Sargent's regiment that became the 16th Continental Regiment and Captain John Wiley's company. Now, it's absolutely amazing to me that he was able to enlist in the Army in late October, because virtually the day he enlisted, Washington was distributing orders to his high-ranking officers not to enlist any black men. He did not want black men in the Army, free or enslaved. And somehow Jacob was able to convince Captain Wiley or Colonel Sargent or somebody to take him. And they did, basically going against Washington's orders. Jacob spent November and December wondering if he was going to get discharged from the Army simply because he was black, because Washington kept on this thing about not getting black men. But by the end of December 75, 2 months after he enlisted, Washington did change his mind. A number of his white officers tried to convince him that black men made just as good soldiers as white men. Not enough white men were volunteering for the Army, and the British Army was actively encouraging black men to enlist in the British forces. So they got Washington to reverse his policy, at least to the point of saying any man who's already in the Army can stay, but we just won't try to enlist anymore. That's going to change after a while, but that change kept Jacob's ability to stay in the Army to finish out his year. He served starting from the day he enlisted at the Siege of Boston in 70-75, and that continued until March, when the British left after they took the cannon that Colonel Knox brought from Ticonderoga and put them on the Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston and forced the British to leave Boston. And then Jacob was in the group that stayed around Boston to prevent the British from coming back until July of 76. And then his regiment was sent to New York City, and they took part in the New York campaign. He was not active in the Battle of Brooklyn or Battle of Long Island at the end of August, but he was at the battle, right in the Battle of Harlem Heights in the middle of September, and then in the Battle of White Plains at the end of October. And during the whole time that he was in New York, in between those and all, there was action going on, even if it wasn't a full-fledged battle. So he was, again, in an exhausting situation, often a perilous situation, and the Army was just losing men right and left to disease from the the encampments that weren't kept clean, as well as everything else that caused disease. Now, you know that after the Battle of White Plains, Washington then retreated across New Jersey, crossed to Pennsylvania at Trenton, and took up quarters for his troops in Bucks County. Jacob did not make that retreat across New Jersey. Jacob was left behind around White Plains and the Hudson River up there with General Charles Lee. And Charles Lee was ordered by Washington to join him in Bucks County, but Lee kept resisting for various reasons. And when they finally left with Lee, Lee got as far as Morristown, and then he got himself captured by the British as an individual at a tavern by a British patrol. And then General John Sullivan took over Jacob's regiment and all the other regiments that had been under Lee. And we're talking 1,000 or more men here. And they continued on and crossed up the Delaware River, and then came down the Pennsylvania side to join up with Washington near Washington's Crossing. And that they got there only about 2 or 3 days before December 25th, 26. So that's how Jacob got to the situation where he crossed with Washington. And you can see that this is going to be why he was so, I think, ready to leave the Army when his enlistment was up. And a combination of what he had gone through, combined with the fact that he was close to where he could find his mother and find out who he was. And also, he was now about 23 years old, and he wanted to build a life for himself. He was tired of having somebody else in authority over him and owning his time, if you will, whether it be indenture or the Army. And he wanted to be independent. He had a great vision of what he wanted. And within 3 years, he was able to own a house and 46 acres of farmland in Amwell. And this is quite unusual because there were restrictions on land ownership for free black men. And he was able to overcome that. I have to say that his ownership did not last real long. If you know, during the Revolution, the economy was terrible. There were terrible inflation during the war years. It was difficult for anybody, black or white, to stay out of debt and to keep going. And Jacob suffered with that. Now, that doesn't mean that he went into extreme poverty by any means, but he could not necessarily own land all the time. But in 1780, when he did own that land, he was one of only 2 free black men in Amwell Township who were listed in the tax records as owning land. It was extremely unusual. There were other free black men, and there were a number of enslaved men, of course, but he was very unusual. As a man living free in Amwell Township, he was required by law to sign into his local militia company. That local militia company was under Captain Philip Snook in the 3rd Hunterdon Regiment. Amwell Township was the only township that made up the 3rd Hunterdon Regiment. And they were very happy to have Jacob. Nobody wanted to keep him out because think about what he's got. He's got 14 months of veteran professional military service to go into the part-time, very amateur local militia. And the men are going to look at his skills and learn from him and count on him in dangerous situations and whatnot. And he's actually going to make a number of friends in the militia. Now, Captain Snook, by the way, was the brother-in-law of Henry Wambaugh. Remember him, the first farmer who owned Jacob's indenture time. That man's brother-in-law is now going to become his commander in the militia. Wambaugh was still alive. Several of the men who had owned his time were still alive and living in the area. So he not only went back to Mom, he went back to other people that he had known as a child in Amwell. During the rest of the war, the remaining 6 years of the war, he was called out a number of times on 1-month tours of duty, just as all the militiamen in Amwell Township were. I put some arrows on a map to show you that even though the British were way over in New York, Staten Island, Long Island, even over on the west side of New Jersey, the militiamen were called out to defend East Jersey from British incursions, foraging parties, things like that. So it was getting to be almost a full-time occupation to be in the militia, even where the British weren't. In at least one of the engagements near Newark, Jacob was captured and briefly held by a Hessian patrol. And it was only because other militia came along and disrupted the Hessians, who had to make a quick getaway because they were outnumbered, that he was kind of left behind by them and was able to rejoin his militia. So he has a lot of stories to tell, and I tell them in the book about some of these specific situations, and including the Battle of Monmouth. He also participated in that. So he represents the difficulty that really all farmers in Amwell Township and Hopewell Township, for that matter, had. They were trying to keep the economy going. At the same time, they were getting called out frequently on military duty for a month or more at a time. And those months were often in the best weather and not in the winter time when the farms were less busy. So it was a tough time. After his military service, after he was no longer needing to go out on these month-long tours of militia duty, he still was in a fight. Maybe we won independence. Maybe that revolution was pretty much in hindsight, although we still didn't have a constitution, still hadn't developed the country fully. But he still needed to work for human freedoms. He was very much opposed to slavery. He knew a lot of enslaved people, even though he had not been enslaved himself. And he also knew of the systemic racism that had grown out of slavery, and that needed to be abolished just as much as the system of slavery did itself. For just one thing, for example, in the late 1790s, the state legislature passed a law that free black men had to carry a pass from the government proving that they were not enslaved. So even at that time, after the revolution was over, individual free black men traveling around were considered to be slaves by white people that they encountered. There was enough slavery going on that people should expect that, so to speak. And so for a free black man to not be arrested as a runaway, put in jail as a runaway, whatever, they had to carry a pass to prove their status. And that's just one thing that he had to come up against. In 1789, he was 35 years old, still trying to establish his farm, but he was ready to marry and start a family. I don't think he wanted to get to the point where he was too old to have kids and be too old a father when his children were young. So he decided to get married. And he married an enslaved woman whose name was Mary. She was 13 years younger than him. Don't know how he got to know her, but he did, and decided to get married. Now, for a free black man to marry an enslaved woman, he's got a problem. Normally, when a man wants to marry a woman, he's got to deal with her family, her father perhaps, that kind of thing. But for an enslaved woman, he had to deal with her owner. She was just one of several enslaved people owned by a man named Nathaniel Hunt, who I believe lived in today's Lawrence Township. Those of you in Hopewell Valley will know that there's, the Hunt family is very widespread, and there's a number of Nathaniels, but I think he was the one in Lawrence Township. And Jacob is going to have to work out with Nathaniel for permission to marry his enslaved woman. For example, once she's married, is she going to go and live with Jacob, who's a free man? What's going to happen here? Well, Jacob is able to work out with Nathaniel that Nathaniel is going to sell Mary to him on their wedding day. So Nathaniel made Jacob a slave owner. And that didn't last long because he certainly freed Mary pretty darn quick. People sometimes ask me the question, particularly, let me back up 1 second. On their wedding day, Nathaniel Hunt acted much more like Mary's father than her enslaver. The wedding was held at the Hunt home. Members of the Hunt family participated. It was an integrated community event for this wedding. But we don't know who Mary's parents actually were. Nathaniel Hunt might have acted like it, but we don't know if he was her father. She never mentions a father or a mother. We know that she had lived with Nathaniel Hunt for a large part of her life, possibly her whole life. We just don't know. But some people ask me if Nathaniel Hunt was considering himself almost in the role of a father to her, why didn't he just free her in order to marry Jacob? It's very possible that he sold her for, a very pittance of an amount, just a symbolic amount, rather than at quote unquote market price. But he did that for a very important reason that relates to the enslavement situation. If Nathaniel Hunt had freed Mary before the wedding, he would have been responsible for her for the rest of her life if she ever needed public assistance. The systemic racism of the time felt that any black person who became free wasn't going to be able to economically survive on their own and was going to fall back on public assistance. So Nathaniel Hunt had to, agree, if he freed her, that he would support her. By selling her to Jacob, he didn't have to worry about that anymore. Jacob became the person who would free her and be responsible for her economic situation. So that, it's an interesting tidbit, but it really shows what he, how enslaved people and free blacks, had a difficult life associating with each other. Now, by 1801, Jacob had established a 115-acre farm near Flemington. He appears in the 1802 and 1809 tax records owning that amount. And on this 1851 map you see on the left, you see N. Francis on a farm just outside of Flemington, the blue area. And this was a farm owned by his son Nathaniel in 1851. This is, a decade or two after Jacob's death. But that was probably the farm that Jacob had, and he turned it over to his son. And Jacob and Mary are going to move to Flemington. Before they do that, they actually joined the Flemington Baptist Church. They run into a little bit of resistance to that. The church is basically white people, although they do have both enslaved and free members. And they do finally get baptized on May 11th in 1805. And they're going to stay in the church for 30 years or more. Now, like I say, when they retired from that farm that you saw on the previous map, they moved into the town of Flemington. And the first home that they lived in, where you see the arrow there, just near the Baptist church, was actually a house owned by the Baptist church that they rented from the church. And they rented from, give or take a year, 1810 until 1829. So almost 20 years. They became very famous. Again, they're kind of retired from farming, for the ginger cakes that Mary made, and also the root beer that Mary made, and that she kept the root beer on tap in their basement in a creek that ran under their house, to keep it cold. And you see across from their house the Academy building, and that was the Flemington Academy, which was kind of like a private high school. It was built in the town, and she would give ginger cakes and root beer to the kids during recess and that sort of thing. And the parents would hire her to do that on Sundays when they would have family picnics and things like that. Now, the problem with their church membership is that their minister, Charles Bartlett, was a leading voice for abolition, but the wrong kind of abolition, the kind that said free the slaves, but then send them to Africa and have them colonize Africa. We don't want them here in the United States. So they had to put up with that from their minister. In 1826, they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and Jacob is still alive and participates in a parade through the town. And, you know, there's about 41 veterans of the revolution. Only 2 of them are black veterans, the rest are white. And Jacob is kind of snubbed because the veterans carried flags representing the different battles of the revolution. There was one flag for each battle, and the man carrying the flag was supposed to be someone who fought in the battle. Well, Jacob, we know, fought in the Battle of Trenton, but he didn't carry the flag. They gave it to a white man who was nowhere near the Battle of Trenton. So you see some racism going on there, too. In 1832, he applied for a pension, and this is the opening statement. And notice that the court person who took his dictation of his statement of service actually went back and wrote in that he was a colored man. That's going to be important because they didn't recognize the validity of statements by colored men unless they could be backed up by white men. So they had to kind of get that in there. Also, we know that Jacob was illiterate because he signed with an X, and this is one of the first instances we see of that. Now, when he dictated his will a couple years later in 1836, notice that he again signed with his mark, but his 2 sons, Nathaniel and Isaac, who witnessed the will and all, they can write their own names. Jacob and Mary made sure their kids got educated, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. This is just one example. But Jacob raises a very interesting question in his will. In the items where he is granting bequests to his children, normally, as I've highlighted here, he names each child as my son, Asa, or my daughter, Jane. You know, there was different children. However, for one child, Phoebe, he describes her as the daughter of my beloved wife, Mary. Now, what does this mean? He's got 9 kids. 8 of them, he says, are his son or daughter. One of them, he says, is the daughter of my wife, Mary. Phoebe was also the oldest child and was born not too long after they were married. It's very possible that Mary was pregnant with Phoebe at the time of the wedding. So who was Phoebe's father? Obviously, Jacob acted as her father, but he knew he wasn't her biological father. And we have no idea. But anyway, Jacob certainly adopted her, treated her like his own daughter. They were just as close as if he had been her biological father. When he died, shortly after making the will, he got a pretty long death notice in the local Flemington paper that mentioned his 30-year membership in the Baptist Church, that noted that he raised a large family in a credible manner to his judgment and his Christian character, and lived to see them doing well, that his fidelity and good conduct as a soldier in the Revolution were the subject of remark and received the approbation of his officers, and that he was deservedly respected by all who knew him. This is most unusual for a black man to have this kind of a death notice. It's a little unusual for a white man to have one this long, by the way. This was done by the editor, not by Jacob's family. And actually, I kind of did a word count and everything, and this is the longest death notice that was published that year, and really went into great detail and lauding of Jacob's character. So he was a very well-respected man in Flemington. If you want to see his tombstone, he was buried behind the Baptist church. The brick building that you see on the right of the driveway coming in, that's the back of the church, and the cemetery is right there. Jacob's tomb his tombstone is right at the end of a handicap parking spot there. But it's right in the first line of the cemetery and the oldest part. And most of the people around him are white people. So he wasn't buried in a separate part. He did get a tombstone, which is very unusual at that time, and it's very well engraved. It survives today, and it just says a lot about him. His inventory of his estate shows that he lived a decent lifestyle. It was not a wealthy lifestyle by any means, but it was certainly decent, kind of middle class in some ways. The most expensive item in his inventory were the books and other things belonging to his son Abner Francis. Abner was his youngest son, and Abner was the best educated of his son. And Abner went on to work with Frederick Douglass in New York State, California, Oregon, and British Columbia. And he did writing for Frederick Douglass. He wrote for Frederick Douglass's newspapers and things like that. He often served as a secretary for abolitionist meetings. He was quite the active and well-known abolitionist across the country. In one of his letters, he was praising John Quincy Adams on the death of Quincy Adams, a eulogy. And he said, "I should like to have the world know that the same principles of 76, which led the great mind of John Quincy Adams to energetic action, to advise in behalf of his country to throw off the British yoke, actuated my father to shoulder his musket and serve through a bloody contest. And not only my father's, but the blood of colored men was freely shed in that struggle for national independence." And Abner is using that idea to suggest not only abolition, but again, that idea of equality between the races, so that black men, when they were freed from slavery, would be just as equal citizens as white men and not be sent to Africa. Now, Mary lived a little bit longer, but in 1844 she died, and her death statement in the papers simply identified her as a colored woman who was of advanced age. She didn't get the write-up that Jacob did. That says probably more about her being a woman than about her being black, actually. And she also has her headstone in the Baptist Church Cemetery, and fortunately, it's right beside Jacob. The two of them are together there. And somewhat back from them in a later part of more modern part of the cemetery are their children, Nathaniel and his wife, and then several of their grandchildren in a family plot there, going from the mid to late 1800s. I was unable to trace any of his children's children beyond that generation. Many of his children didn't have sons or daughters. Some who did, the children died young before they got married, and some children who lived to adulthood didn't get married. So it's really a tough thing. I would hope that there was a descendant living out there. I would love to meet one and see if there's any family stories that I should know about, and also to let them know about Jacob and Mary if they don't know. So that's basically the story that I wanted to tell. I go back to the cover of the book, and you can just quickly see again his world and the dates that he lived in. And I would love to take any questions that you might have at this point. So Anna, if you can take over.
Yeah, I will pose those questions to you. Thank you so much, Larry. I'm always so impressed with the research, and I always love your presentations, how you augment with the maps. I feel like it it successfully relays the message that you're trying to tell. And I guess one of the things I wanted to know while and I do want to invite people to go ahead in the chat bubble and to enter their questions.
Hmm.
When you were doing your research, did you go down any rabbit holes? Like, did you have any white whales where you were just bound and determined to find it, and you finally just had to give up on it?
Almost everything. No, I mean, one of the things that I chose the title, The Revolutionary World, rather than to title it a biography. I wanted to emphasize that it's about his world and how he fits into it, because I couldn't find specific things about how he felt about stuff. He didn't write, He made that one statement for his pension, which was quite lengthy and gave a lot of information about himself beyond what he did in the military. But there's really basically that one thing. And there's a few other items in that application. He's got statements from some of his white friends, who substantiate what he said. Remember, I said black men, they had to have white people to speak up for them.
Right.
And there's a lot of stuff from Mary in his pension file, because after he died, she applied for a widow's pension. So a lot of stuff about their wedding and her situation as an enslaved person was there. But mostly what I talk a lot about his experiences in the Army. And what I had to do there, aside from the comments that he made, I just had to really research that regiment and look at diaries of other soldiers who were in that regiment, and memoirs and that kind of thing, as well as military records, to get an idea of where he was at different times, what was happening all around him, and then do the same thing when he was a civilian. I had to look at what are the laws that a free black man had to live under,
Right.
what was happening to free black men in general, and that sort of thing. And it was so frustrating because I wanted to know specifically
Right.
that I could say about him,
So thank you, because I kept wondering. I'm like, because you were saying, there were certain things you couldn't find, and I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, I know that you're just persistent. I'm like, I know that he was trying to find these things. There are
Oh
some
yeah.
questions. You're also
No,
getting. Oh, go ahead, Larry. I'm sorry.
in history, and when you research history, there's always dead ends and rabbit holes and stuff like that. It's just part of the story.
Yeah, it was
you have to
part
be
of the
willing to
territory,
live with
right?
that. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean you give up. I mean, you keep trying like crazy, and you keep thinking, what angle can I take on this that I haven't taken yet to try to find it, And
Yeah.
you're constantly, talking to yourself, trying to find a way to locate something. But some things just don't exist anymore. That some records just don't exist. So it's
I
hard.
do want to let you know that there's just tons of kudos coming through the chat. So I want to make sure that I let you know that people can tell that you've just done a lot of work and just such a thorough and engaging presentation. And I do have a couple questions if you have some time to answer some.
Sure.
Okay. So there was one of the participants asked, there is a Gulick farm near Rockwell, East Amwell. Is that Jacob Francis's origin?
Well, one of the holes is I don't know where in Amwell Township he was born and where he lived.
Okay.
Where his mother lived, or even where he had his early farm, because there's no deed or anything like that I can find for it. It's just the tax record, which doesn't say where it is. Now, it's also important to know that at the time that he lived, Amwell Township was huge. It was both East and West Amwell Township. It was Raritan Township. It was, a number, Delaware Township, just a whole bunch of places that are separate today were all part of what was known as Amwell. So he had a big area that I'd have to contemplate. So,
right.
But my own sense is I think he was probably more East Amwell, because then when he did buy his farm that is accountable by deeds and that kind of thing, it was that one near Flemington, and that's where he finally settled and lived the last decade or couple decades of his life.
Okay. And then you covered this a little bit in the presentation, and maybe you can do a recap, like how were indentured people treated in comparison to slaves?
Well, indentured people were not necessarily, it was not necessarily a racial thing. In other words, there were a lot of white indentured servants. In fact, that was typically an indentured servant was white. Jacob's unusual being a black indentured servant. They, in a way, it was a given length of time of enslavement because they were definitely under the control of another individual. They had more rights than enslaved people did in terms of if the owner mistreated them in some way, they had more options to, get get justice and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they were going to be free at the end of their indenture.
Right.
It was also typical that at the end of their indenture, the owner of their time gave them some new clothes, maybe some money, helped them make the switch from indenture to a free life again. And that, of course, there was no guarantee of that in slavery.
Right, right.
So it was definitely a different situation. And
then,
indenture could be a short time. It could only be a couple of years. He had a very long indenture. And sometimes it was an adult who became indentured, not a child.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest ways that people got indentured was to come over from Europe on a ship that they couldn't pay their passage. But they made arrangements with the ship captain that when they got to a port in America, they would essentially be auctioned off as an indentured person. And so the person who bought their time paid the captain of the ship, the cost of their passage, and then the indentured person worked off that money. So it might be a couple of years, maybe as much as 5 or 6 would be a long one. And then they were free again once they had paid that debt to get them across the ocean.
Here's an interesting question. How much time did it take you to acquire all this research? How long have you been working on this book?
Well, 10 years or so. But I have to say that the vast majority of the research was done in the last 2 years.
Okay.
But it's been on my mind. It's been something that I've looked for stuff casually while I was writing the other books. You mentioned I had written some other books.
Yes.
And he came to my attention because of those other books. Actually, the first one that I wrote about the New Jersey Militia is when I first ran into him. And I just thought his story was so fascinating. And he just came across in his statement, his dictated statement, he came across so personal that I felt like I was getting to know him a little bit,
Oh, wow.
And I just thought he seemed like not only an interesting person, but a nice person, somebody I would want to sit down and talk to. And so many of the people who did comment about him at various times in his life, he apparently was very easy to get to know and liked to sit down and chat with people, and stuff like that. So, that just kept building as I would do research on him, and I would see that more and more. So I saw him as a really successful man who, nobody knows about, and I thought people should know about him.
Right. Right. Well, I know, I mean, again, just the comments. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send some of the comments to you that have been coming in. People are very appreciative, just enjoying what you shared this evening.
Oh, good, good.
Someone has asked about your book, and I put Larry's link, wlkitterhistorian.com, into the
Right.
chat. And I know that you can access how to get his book through the website there. Is it also being sold at the Howell Farm, Larry?
It's not at the Howell Farm right now. It
Okay.
is being sold at if they still have some, at the barracks in Trenton, and it's being sold at Washington Crossing Park on the PA side. It's being sold at Act Two Books in Flemington. But most of all, it's always available on Amazon.
Yeah. Our love-hate relationship with Amazon.
Yeah,
But
well,
I,
I
I
understand that, and I've got
yeah.
the same issue. But I think it's important. I think it's important that people know that while I had a publisher for my other recent books, I did not have a publisher for this book.
Oh.
I self-published this, and I did it through a company that's a subsidiary of Amazon. And the reason I used that subsidiary is because I had used them once before I got a publisher.
Right.
And it was very easy for me to do. I knew the system, and it works well for me as the author. But it also means that Amazon is going to be the distributor of note. And it's going to be very hard for other bookstores and things like that to get hold of it without going through me rather than through Amazon. But for individual people, it's going to be easier to go through Amazon.
Yeah, and I think you're going to get a greater reach using Amazon. So I wanted to let people know that I put a link to your website on there because it
Mm-hmm.
has a link to your book as well. So
Okay,
letting people know how to get it, because I do think there's some people who are interested in getting the book.
good.
Um, I do want to thank everyone again for their patience at the beginning of the evening with our technical difficulties. Larry, thank you so much for
Mm-hmm.
your tenacity while we worked through everything.
Well, thank you
Uh,
for all your help.
it was my
Boy,
pleasure. And I do want to give a shout out to the Hunt School students that are here tonight. Thank you for coming
yes.
to
Well,
our.
let me give a shout out too. Yes, Mrs. Moose is a good friend of mine, guys. Yeah. So.
So again, thank you everybody, and we do encourage you. I also put links to the Hopewell Valley Historical Society, the Hopewell Museum, as well as the Mercer County Library System. And so we invite you to look at those websites and see events that are coming up and to see what we're up to and what we're doing. So
Mm-hmm.
thank you everybody and have a good night.
Okay. Thanks, and thanks again, Anna.
Thank you, Larry. I'll talk to you soon, okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.